we rolling? I think we're good. Okay, so new video style. I haven't posted like this in a minute, but I decided I'd do a little video explaining to you guys how you should tune a gearbox. I'm talking about whether you're doing a custom build, where you have a stock gun that you've used for a minute and you're just trying to breathe some new life into it, or you just bought a boneyard gun that you're trying to get back up in working condition. This is the steps I personally take when trying to address this problem. So right now we have the EFCS gearbox that was originally the heart of the P-Boys, but again, stay tuned in the future, you guys will see the new system we have for that. I'm going to go ahead and take this screw out right here so we can separate this gearbox into its two respective halves, and I'll pull out some more internal components so I can make my points specifically clear. Let me just focus on this half right now. Now the first thing you want to do is tear down your gun to the bare shell. So if you have the EFCS gearbox, tear it down to this, so you have these two halves and only these two halves on their own. Now the first step you're going to want to do is use a degreaser. I like using whatever I have around the house, so right now I have a bottle of Kaboom OxiClean, Foamtastic, whatever that stuff's called. It's just a basic degreaser. Any sort of cleaning product's going to work. OxiClean, what's another one of them? I forget. But basically any sort of degreaser you can use to clean off this gearbox. If you don't have a degreaser, you can use dish soap like Dawn dish soap. Anything that's going to be able to just get the stock gear and grease and grime off of this gearbox. You want it down a really nice smooth finish because we're going to be doing some metal work with this guy. Okay, so step one was pretty straightforward. The next thing you're going to want to do is actually do some gearbox work. Now, metal work. Now, the main thing that you're going to have to focus on is the quality of gearbox you have out of the box. You have a higher end gun, especially like an EFCS gearbox, this really doesn't need metal work out of the box unless you're throwing in some really crazy components. If you have like a Crytek, Crytek's not a good example. If you have like a VFC Avalon, or if you have a Classic Army Nemesis line or a GMP, you're really not going to need to do too much gearbox work because those shells are on a higher end level. If you have something cheaper like a Lancer Tactical or a Combat Machine or something along the lines of that, then yeah, you're probably going to want to have to do a little bit of metal work to get these things really smoothed down. Now in 2019, going on to 2020, this isn't really as true, even on the budget line guns, because those are coming with much nicer gearbox shells. But if you're buying like an old gun that like first came out in like 2011, a gun that might have been sitting on a shelf for 3 to 4 years, then this might be something to consider because the internal specs aren't going to be up to date with the new standards in airsoft. So the first thing I personally would do after you clean it is sand it down. There's multiple different ways you can go about sanding it. Depending on the level of job, you can stick with standard sandpaper. That works really well. Another what you can do is actually use a sanding wheel. So this is one of the sanding wheels I've used. I use this on my D-Boys gearbox. Kind of just spoil the new P-Boys build. But I've used this on gearboxes before. It's just a standard wheel. It's almost like sandpaper pieces that it will rotate around in a rotary tool. You can use this to sand down very quickly. It's not the most precise, but if you have like a lot of different imperfections on your gearbox or a painted internal gearbox, it's a very fast and efficient way to get rid of that big stuff. After you do that, I still will go back over with the standard sandpaper. Parts I would be looking to sand is the surface of the gearbox where the gears sit. I would look at sanding the rails where the piston runs. I would even, if possible, try sanding the rail for the tab plate. That's going to make a pretty big difference. Now, again, 400 grit is where you probably, I guess you want to start if you really have like bad imperfections, you're trying to take the paint off. I would stop around 1,000th grit. If you really want to get it smooth, you can go 2,000 grit. But 1,000 grit is probably on the high end of where I personally would sand a gearbox. I'll hit it with 1,000 grit. Actually, no, I hit it with the sanding wheel, hit it with 1,000 grit sandpaper. After that, I use my metal polish. Use a little bit of metal polish, throw that on either a polishing wheel or on a paper towel or something similar like that, a rag, and just work that into the metal. That's really going to polish and make the surface really smooth. So what you're left with is a uniformly smooth metal surface, so everything's just going to be able to run smoothly in the gearbox. Think of it as like, the Silver Edge gearbox is known for having a really nice polished internal gearbox. Think of that like you're doing your own Silver Edge style internal gearbox. Okay, so the next step I would do is shim the gearbox. So again, you still have your base shell. I would pull out your bushings, put them into the respective spaces. You can glue them in place, but again, it depends on your shell. If you have a higher quality shell, like a VFC or GMP, Crytek, those guns really aren't going to need to have the gear or the bushings glued into place because it's high quality metal. I've noticed with like a Cyma gearbox or like a D-Boys gearbox, or lower quality gearbox shell, around the gearbox or the bushings, you can actually have metal deformation and warping. So over time, as your gun is ran and rebuilt and over again, the hole where the bushing sits is going to expand, and you don't want that. Higher end gearboxes don't do it as much. Lower end gearboxes do it more often. So if it's lower end gearbox, I will glue them in. I personally either recommend like super glue, like Gorilla Clear super glue, the gel, or that works really well. I've used metal epoxy putty in the past. That works pretty well. Epoxy, standard epoxy, works really well as well. So you have options to glue your bushings in place. After you do that, shim the gearbox like you would normally shim a gun. Pretty basic stuff. Beveled pinion method works really well. I'm not going to do a tutorial on how to shim. You can find that in links in the description, but also just look on Google and look up how to shim a gearbox, beveled pinion method, whatever you might do. You're going to find great videos, much better than I could produce. Alright, so you got your gearbox polished and sandy, you got your gears properly shimmed. Next thing I would do is install your trigger system. So whether it's a EFCS gearbox like this, you're just installing the stock components, or if you're going to install Gate Titan, I will pull the gears completely out of the gun with their shims and keep them over to the side. And then, so you still have your clean gearbox, no grease or anything getting in the way. Install your trigger system properly, make sure it's all fine-tuned and working, functioning properly. And then you can throw your gears back in and move on to putting in the compression components. Now I usually assemble the compression components completely separately, so I will put the Teflon tape on the cylinder head and attach that to the cylinder, glue the Teflon, or glue the buffer on the end of the cylinder head, attach the piston head to the piston, short stroke the piston if I need to, Swiss cheese it, so on and so forth, put silicone grease on it. Do all these things outside of the gearbox. And once your compressor components are good, you'll have like your air nozzle, cylinder, cylinder head, piston head, and tappet plate all together in one piece, and you can just plop it right in right here, and you're good to go. After you're done with that, there really isn't too much else to do. Make sure all the other small components are in place, like the springs for the tappet plate, the cutoff lever, the anti-reversal latch, everything else that you need to install. Make sure all the small parts are in place and in order. Take your spring guide, throw it in your spring, ram it in the back if you don't have if you have a standard gearbox. If you have a quick change spring guide, put the second half on top. Make sure everything sits properly. Put your screws in, throw your spring and spring guide in the back, and you're good to go. Now, a lot of people will think that this is the end of the video, but there's one last step, one critical last step that I highly recommend and that I personally started doing with my builds, and it's really, I reap the benefits of doing this. So put your gun under a stress test. You can do this with a standard battery. I recommend an 11-1 LiPo, and you want to break in the gearbox over a period of time. Usually, you want to make sure that it's able to do this off the bat. So you don't actually have to fire BBs. You really just want to cycle the gearbox and make sure that everything is broken in. A quick example I will give is whenever you're tuning an engine or you do an engine build for a high-performance engine, you're throwing forged internals on the inside, custom camshafts, a turbo kit, any sort of engine build on a performance car, one of the first things you do before you actually get the car tuned is you let the engine break in. You put in a certain oil on the inside of the engine, specifically for the break-in. You run the engine for about I would say 4,000 to 5,000 miles. It really depends on the build, but you run the engine in almost like a base tune mode and make sure all the parts are in order. And then once you break the engine in, you will disassemble the engine or drain the oil on the engine actually, and make sure all the it's in good shape. And once it's broken in, then you can tune it and then you can drive the gun or drive the car. Same thing with a airsoft gun. So what I personally do is I will take an 11-1 LiPo, hook it up to the gun, and let it dry fire in full auto for 5 to 10 minutes. And this is a good stress test because first off, your gun's never going to be put through that much scrutiny. you're going to break in all the internal parts. You're also going to break in the motor in the process, and you're going to be able to ensure that you did a proper job building this gun. If you can sustain 5 to 10 minutes of full auto fire, dry firing on a gun, you're pretty much going to be able to sustain whatever it has you in the future. And if any problems are there with your internals, something's going to give in that 5 to 10 minute range. Now, whether or not you want to risk, I don't know, breaking your gun in that 5 to 10 minute range is your own discretion. That's what I personally do. And it just, forces you to say, okay, I need to do better quality work to make sure nothing does break. But usually if something does break, it's something minor like a tap plate spring or something along the lines of that. If you did like something bad in your shimming job, or you don't have a part installed properly, or you just buy poor quality parts, then yeah, something's going to break. But overall, if you take your time and get quality parts and do good work, things aren't going to break. It's just going to break in. And then once you do that, you want to disassemble your gun completely again, like we did from the beginning, down to the bare gearbox shell. Have your gear sitting over to one side, your compression components over here. Take out your trigger, and you want to clean the gearbox 100%. Same degreaser we used before, hot water, soapy water, whatever you want to do. Clean it down to the bare metal. What you will notice is that, first off, that silicone and synthetic grease you threw in your gun is going to be pitch black. You're going to see a lot of metal shavings, a lot of plastic shavings on the inside of the gun because the parts that you threw in there weren't the right spec to each other. Well, after cycling it in a high rate of fire for about 5 to 10 minutes, you've shaven off all those parts that aren't lining up, are misaligned, and you clean that off of the gun. So when you put it back together, the tapper plate's going to line up properly with the sector gear, and the piston's going to line up properly with the sector gear. The piston's going to line up properly with the rails and the gearbox because you shaved off all the parts that don't fit that spec. So clean all that stuff out because you don't want metal and plastic shavings just sitting in your gun and causing more problems in the future. Clean off your gears. You don't have to completely degrease them. I personally do. I just clean off all the grease. You don't have to really mess with this compression components because that really isn't going to change. Just check to see, if the buffer on the end of the cylinder head is come off, or if the O-ring on the piston head is, in poor condition, or if the rails on the piston are shaving off too much. If that's the issue, then you might have to replace a component. But usually you can leave those alone and they're going to be perfectly fine. It's really just a drivetrain you're looking at, so the gears, motor, piston that you're really looking at, making sure we want that to break in. So once you do that, re-grease it, throw all the stock components back in, and voila, you're done. You have your completely built gun with all the internals you want, and it's broken in and it's going to work properly for you. So this is going to first ensure that your gun's able to sustain, heavy load because you threw it into that excruciatingly tough stress test. But you're also going to have all your parts broken in, and it's going to be a clean slate. You're not going to have metal shavings or plastic shavings that you would have accumulated over time anyway, not taking that break-in period. That metal shaving, that plastic shaving could, cause more damage down the road, and then thus shorten the longevity of your gun. So that's really all I got for this video. Pretty basic stuff, just the steps I go through when I tune a gearbox, do a complete custom gearbox build, or whatever might have you. These are the steps I take to ensure that my guns last a long time and function and perform at a high level. So that's all I got for this video. I hope I'll catch you in the next one. See you guys later.